Dana White is a blood-sucking capitalist who profits off of the slave labor of his employees. He drinks the blood of dead fighters, and all he does is to turn a capitalist profit so he can buy multi-million-dollar mansions. Welcome to the third episode of the Dialectic with your co-host Anirudh Garg.
And Daniel G.
He finally did it. Give him a hand.
Second time in a row.
Now let's do this. Let's do this. All right. Today we have a very special episode. We're going to be talking about both MMA and COVID-19. But first with MMA, the people versus Dana White. In August of 2020, Jon Jones vacated the light heavyweight belt after failing to secure himself a pay raise. He ostensibly moved up to the heavyweight division and pined for a title. After failing more, he returned to deadlifting and juicing in his garage. Jon Jones is a clown, but he did begin the latest discourse on UFC fighter pay. New information from a lawsuit filed by former fighter Kung Lee showed that in 2020, UFC fighters were only paid 19% of the revenue generated by the UFC. For context, NFL players made nearly 50% of their organization's revenue. The answer is clear. Fighters are underpaid. The primary culprit is the UFC president, Dana White. Dana White is one of the greatest fight promoters in human history. He took an organization on the verge of bankruptcy and turned it into a cash cow, all while putting together some of the most exciting fights in living memory. Unfortunately, his success has been used as a bludgeon against all criticism against him. The UFC doesn't look out for the best interests of its fighters. That's not its job. A corporation owes its loyalty to only one group of people, and those are the investors. Let's first understand the structure of the UFC. The Ultimate Fighting Championships is a private company owned by Endeavor Operating Company. On their balance sheets, Endeavor saw a $152 million increase in their EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, from the UFC alone. Unfortunately, the rest of the company saw huge losses. The incredible profitability of the UFC only yielded a slight margin of profit for Endeavor. Every penny counts there. Fighters themselves are independent contractors, not employees. They don't get any healthcare, 401ks, or any other benefit. The NFL will match your 401k contributions 2-1. But the best the UFC can do is after you retire is induct you into the Hall of Fame. Fighters lament that the previous Reebok deal that prevented them from putting their sponsors on their walkout gear, and that was a terrible, terrible deal. But it's been replaced with the Venom deal, which, while better, it still doesn't pay much. Under the new deal, main event fighters get an extra $2,000, main card an extra $1,000, and $500 for every other fighter per fight. Given the cost of being a fighter, that isn't enough. On just the cost of doing business, fighters need to eat healthy, which is expensive. They have gym fees, also expensive. And on top of that, managers take 10%. That's not counting the cost to the body. You can't fight forever. This sport turns your body into a quickly depreciating asset. Brain damage is permanent, possibly leaving many fighters impaired for the rest of their life. If you get injured in training, you're on your own. Your career could be over, and all you have to show for it are expensive medical bills. Dana White is probably a genuinely nice man interpersonally, but his job requires him to hurt a lot of fighters to keep the UFC profitable. Relying on his benevolence is stupidity. Fighters have to fight for their own wages. There needs to be an effort at collective bargaining where the draws of the sport push for better treatment. We saw success on this front recently when Tony Ferguson publicly called for a 50% increase in fight bonuses, something that Dana White acquiesced to. If the fighters band together, then there is hope for better treatment for all fighters. So Daniel, I want to have your opinion on this. What is your take on UFC fighter pay, and what do you think we can do in addition to this to help make sure the fighters are better taken care of?
Well, first I think we have to look at why exactly the fighter pay is so low compared to other sports.
Yeah,
what do you think are the reasons? I'm not actually very sure.
So I kind of touched into this. It's because of the way that they're contracted. So they're individual contractors. Yeah. So what the UFC says is, you can fight with us or you don't have to fight. So for a lot of fighters who are just starting out, the sport itself doesn't pay a lot of money. And so whenever the UFC gives them a contract, the premium of the UFC is so great that they'll unfortunately take any contract that they can get. Because there's such a asymmetry in the bargaining power between the workers for their wages and the employer can have a field day underpaying fighters. It's just like any other labor market.
I don't really understand why the fact that they're not contracted makes it, or the fact that they're independent contracted makes it asymmetrical.
So have you ever heard of the Muhammad Ali Act?
No.
Okay, this is specifically for boxers. But what ended up happening is for a lot of boxers, there was abuse by their managers, by companies hiring them fight promotions. And so it was a huge issue because for them to negotiate on their contract, because as an independent contractor, you don't have a lot of power. For example, Uber is the biggest independent contractor in the world. You deliver for Uber, you're not an employee, you don't get any benefits. There are so many federal regulations and protections and wage protections that you have that are just out the window. When you're a contractor, you can quite literally sign away your rights in a contract. So you could end up losing a lot of your bargaining power and a lot of the legal protections that come with employment.
The thing is, they can still choose, I guess, in terms of like a free market analysis, they could still choose to go to other organizations like Bellator, for example, or One Championship.
Bellator has the same problem. The entire model of being a professional fighter, because the Muhammad Ali Act isn't extended to MMA fighters, it's only for boxers right now, there aren't employment protections.
Mm-hmm.
So those protections in contracts are very necessary for fighters to be able to negotiate. And here's unfortunately the thing. The fighters who have the power to negotiate, those are your draws. Conor McGregor, Khabib, Dustin Poirier, even John Jones. They have negotiating power, but more often than not, they don't really use it in order to help lift other fighters. There's no solidarity between all the fighters. If there was an attempt to unionize or do collective bargaining,
that's actually a really good point, yeah.
Then that would be huge. Like NFL players, there are strict regulations to make sure they're taken care of, which is why they get paid so well. Now, the NFL still has its problems. They had a racist history of denying black athletes compensation for injury because they incorrectly stated that African Americans have lower IQs, therefore, any brain damage they incurred is worth less.
What the heck?
Yeah, so
Christ.
No sports organization is perfect, but the UFC seems to be extra bad because those protections aren't there for the fighters.
Okay, I actually really like that point about bargaining. Well, I mean, about fighters not being able to band together because, I mean, they're like fighting against each other, you know, like they don't even have like a team themselves. So I could definitely see how that's the case. But for example, your point about how the benefits to employment that you get when you're like legally an employee, I still don't see how that plays into like a free market analysis. Because for example, if being an employee means you have to be granted health insurance, then the company could do that, but then just lower your rate. I don't see how that necessarily improves their situation.
So they're in the position where they can't bargain for healthcare. But for example, if you're an employee, they have to give you benefits. They have to give you healthcare. That is by law. The United States requires that of you. If they're contractors, you don't have to do that. So which is why you see a lot of businesses like Uber profit off of turning workers, former taxi drivers, into private contract.
Yeah,
that's a business model.
I get that, but from a business point of view, they could just, in order to match the cost that they did before, just reduce the wages and say, okay, we're lowering your wages because we have to use those wages to give you healthcare. Like, it's just a different form of payment, essentially.
No. So once when you become an employee, right? If you go from contractor to employee, the moment you're full time, right, you have to be paid a minimum wage, which, given how much fighters are paid, might end up actually being way more for a lot of them. You have a minimum wage, and on top of that, you are guaranteed benefits.
Well, I get that argument that like, if you're a minimum wage worker, then obviously if the employer has to give you health insurance, then that's going to increase your pay. If you're an employee, you could have layoffs because of that, arguably.
Yeah.
But in this case, I don't think fighters are making close to minimum wage. So, and it's not really
many fighters are making,
but it's not really a wage
money.
even though, like, because you're paid per fight, so it's not like an hourly wage.
So there are people who will make the argument that fighters only have to fight 3 times a year. They only have to work 3 times a year. That is absolutely absurd.
Yeah.
Being a fighter is a full-time job. You have food expenses. For example, right, if you look at NFL athletes, they have an entire regimen. They have assignments for how much they have to exercise, what their diet is. There are entire prescriptions of what they need to do. Now, fighters can do all of that themselves. They have their own coaches, their own camps. But at the end of the day, we have a huge amount of work that goes into one performance of the night. For any reason, fighters are actually working super hard, but they're not being compensated for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. But like, are there any, because they're not working hourly according to, I mean, they're not actually on the job hourly. Is there any equivalent to the minimum wage? So let's say you multiply the minimum wage by, let's say, 40 hours a week times like 50 weeks a year or something, and then that'll give you approximately, I don't know, like 30, 40K, 50K maybe. And so maybe that could be an equivalent, like if you're a fighter and you fight 3 times a year.
I have a better proposal. Rather than looking at it in terms of wages, look at it in terms of revenue share. For example, let's say if we had requirements that prize fighters, people who are on contract, are entitled to a certain percentage of profits because they're the ones creating those profits, or a certain percentage of the revenue because they're creating those revenues, revenue sharing, stock options. As long as there are ways to compensate them for the work that they provide for the organization, that is a win. Right. I think you would understand it's very important that these fighters, once when they get into the UFC or they get into any organization, they don't actually have the ability to shop around and be competitive. Right? What is your resume as a fighter? That's your highlight reel. Who owns the footage to your highlight reel? Zuffa, the UFC.
Why isn't that the case for the NFL or the NBA?
Because the NFL is one organization. And because they're one organization that essentially has a monopoly on entire day of the week, they have the ability to, they're required by the federal government to go through a lot of restrictions. There are a lot of protections there for the athlete.
Okay. So do you think if there were none of those, then?
Of course, if there are no worker protections, workers would be exploited. That is always going to happen.
So from what I understand, your argument is sort of that because UFC fighters are not employees, they are not under as much government regulation, or the
government
UFC
protections.
is not. Yeah. Whereas even though the NBA and the NFL are pretty much monopolies on the sport, they are subject to even harsher government protections.
It's not harsh protections. That's a very strange
harsh restrictions and strong protections.
Strong protections. Yes. On top of that, NFL players, because they work in teams, it's naturally easier for them to collectively bargain.
Yeah, that's the point.
So there are multiple factors here. So for fighters, what they should try to do, hopefully, is look. Conor McGregor tried to do this, but he only did it for himself, which is some amount of revenue. At least the UFC is better than boxing. Boxing is so top heavy. The top athletes get nearly 90% of the bank of the fight purse. The guys at the bottom on the main card and undercard, they get pennies. They get scraps. So the UFC is at least a bit more equitable and egalitarian. They just need to get paid more. There's just a rising tide lifts all boats in the situation.
So is it Dana White's fault, or is it the government not coming in? And
so it's a confluence of multiple events. Look, Dana White is not all powerful. The socialist part of me definitely wants to say Dana White is a blood-sucking capitalist who profits off of the slave labor of his employees. He drinks the blood of dead fighters, and all he does is to turn a capitalist profit so he can buy multi-million-dollar mansions. But that's incorrect. That's an incorrect view of the situation. Dana White is there because his job is to manage the UFC. He has bosses that he needs to answer to. If the UFC is not profitable, Endeavor, the company that owns UFC, that's going to tank. So he has one boss there. Back when the pandemic hit and he still wanted to do shows, the president of ESPN and an executive of Disney both had to call him and tell him to cancel events. He has masters that he serves. He's just one cog in the machine. He's a very competent person, and he does have a lot of power, so there is some blame that goes to him. But criticizing individuals is not sufficient to change problems. You need to criticize larger and broader systems. Look, Dana White, I mean, it's hard to say who he is as a person. He's very nice to people interpersonally, but his job requires him to do a lot of evil. So placing the blame just on Dana White is insufficient, because getting rid of Dana White just puts another less competent Dana White who'll do the same bad stuff but give us less entertaining shows.
Okay, I was just thinking about, I think we might have touched on this already, but there's sort of a structural problem, which is that because it's an individual sport in a collective organization, whereas, for example, in team sports like the NBA and the NFL, it's a team. So you're almost forced to become an independent contractor, right? As an individual
Well,
athlete.
I mean, tennis players don't have to do that, but tennis players also have
interesting.
sponsors.
Then why is it the case that it's not the problem is not here
So,
in tennis?
Look, the problem exists in the UFC and in tennis. The tennis has some of the same problems as the UFC, but a lot of it is mitigated in terms of the athletes' pay because they have the ability to get sponsors.
Okay.
That is another
Yeah,
issue that
yeah.
I touched on. That the UFC, because of the Reebok deal, now the Venom deal, the athletes have to go on their own to try to make their own money. They have their side ventures. They write books. They do podcasts. They do their own shows. They work for ESPN. They do commentating for the for the UFC. They have other ventures that's there for them to make money. And sponsorships used to be one that was very equitable and fair to everyone. On top of that, those sponsorships could help a lot of local businesses. If I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and steel mill wants to sponsor me, then a steel mill from Columbus, Ohio, my hometown, is sponsoring me. There's a lot of equity, there's a lot of value generated by those sponsorships that just isn't there anymore.
You brought up a very good point, which is that fighters have to do jobs on the side, which, like you said, commentating, podcasting, writing books. Ironically, that actually increases publicity.
Yeah.
And so it's like
it's not a zero-sum game.
You decrease the pay, and then that forces fighters to publicize the UFC. So UFC is actually gaining benefit from decreasing the pay.
Yeah, I have no doubt that Dana White has data scientists looking at these things. His job is to extract a profit for his shareholders. Who are his shareholders? Endeavor. Who is Endeavor's shareholders? Well, I think it's traded on the New York Stock Exchange. So whoever.
I was thinking of buying it because I thought the UFC was going to be more popular, but UFC is only a tiny part of Endeavor. So
it's the most profitable part of Endeavor.
Yeah,
but the UFC has been successful. They made so much money last year. People complained, oh, the UFC doesn't have a live gate. They're going to lose so much money. Chael Sonnen, that fucking moron. This is the worst take anyone has ever had. It's even worse coming from him, a former fighter. He said, "Oh, because there's no live gate, you as a fighter don't have the right to bargain for a higher wage." Even though the UFC made record profits last year. Fuck Chael Sonnen. He has a terrible, terrible understanding of business and economics and
fighting.
Yeah, he's a shitty fighter. I'll say this to his face too.
I mean, his predictions are horrible. So, yeah,
that goes without saying.
Okay, so you brought up sponsors as well.
Yes.
Do you know about any data of how much money fighters were making when the UFC did have sponsors before the Reebok deal?
So again, because fighters are not the best accountants, it's very hard for me to find good data, parse good data, because they also don't like give out their tax returns for me to calculate all that stuff. Most fighters are generally telling me that, oh, they earned way more before the Reebok deal.
So what is the Reebok deal exactly?
So the Reebok.
Why did the UFC?
So I think you remember, right? Everyone came out in the same like white Reebok hoodie that had their name on the back.
Yeah,
you remember that, right?
Yeah.
It's either white or black. Yeah. Before that, they could walk out in any gear. They could wear a jacket, like NASCAR drivers. They had things that says Shell or whatever,
and their pants as well have like logos. All over.
Well, the Reebok deal made that impossible, and you couldn't even get sponsors for anyone who makes competing products. So if Nike really likes you, well, you can't because Reebok makes shoes and shorts. And honestly, why Reebok? They're like such a second-rate company.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering, like, what are the incentives, or what were the incentives for the UFC to even implement it? Like,
the Reebok deal made them so much money.
Why though?
Because Reebok got so much advertisement from the UFC.
But same if they just had free-for-all sponsors.
Well, so here's the difference, right? If Reebok was a sponsor for every single fighter, it's just one of many sponsors. If it is the sponsor, it gets all the attraction. It doesn't have to compete with any other brands it was supposed to sponsor.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that brand itself would be way more profitable. But
what is the incentive for the UFC?
Well, beforehand, with the free-for-all sponsors, every company sponsoring would have only a little bit benefit, but there'd be so many more companies, so the net amount of benefit is not necessarily less.
No, look, so the simple rule in finance: you will take any profit, you will take any venture that has a positive NPV, net present value. That's a project you take. And then if you have a bunch of ventures, you take the one with the highest net present value. Obviously, how much ever money Reebok offered the UFC was greater than any money the UFC would have been making off of any sponsors. And you have to remember, the athletes walking on their shorts, those were sponsors for the athletes. The UFC didn't get any money from there. Reebok making a deal with the UFC, the athletes get a little bit of money. The UFC gets a lot.
Okay, so that's the reason why.
Yeah.
It's because once the UFC implemented the Reebok deal, the money went through the UFC and then
it had to trickle down into the fighters. Trickle down economics, if you will.
So why didn't they just do the same thing but for the fighters? Or is it because the fighters had full freedom with sponsors that it's almost impossible for the UFC to be like, okay, give me some of this money? Like, I think that's probably a better reason to explain.
I mean, how would you? The UFC would have to make a rule that fighters could only put sponsors if the UFC gets a cut of the sponsors.
Yeah.
And that is like strangely authoritarian.
I mean, same with the Reebok deal.
Yeah, it is. It was probably the optics of the Reebok deal probably looked better, right? It looks bad when the UFC is stealing money from the fighters by taking money from their sponsors. It looks a lot better if they're stealing money from their fighters by a supposed Reebok deal that would give money for all fighters, even those who couldn't find sponsors. There's also an optics game that you have to look at.
Yeah, it's like false egalitarian. Well, I guess not false. It is egalitarianism.
No, it's corporate virtue signaling.
Yeah.
Corporations love virtue signaling. It's a great way for them to do stuff that we would view morally objectionably, but for them profitable. Again, it's all in the name of doing business. The function of a corporation is not to create a better world. It's not to create a better society. It's not to take care of their employees. People weirdly state sometimes that the goal of a corporation is to create jobs, it's the exact opposite. The goal of a corporation is to get rid of jobs. The goal of the corporation is to make as much money possible while cutting costs. Labor is the biggest cost. If they could get rid of you and still make the same amount of money, they will get rid of you. The job of a corporation is to make sure there are as few jobs as possible, which, again, we design them for that thing. Corporations are not inherently bad. They're not inherently good. They're just a tool. Unfortunately, the tool used in nefarious ways can have harmful effects for the people who are generating value for us. I want UFC fighters to be paid well. And even if I buy lots of pay-per-views, if I buy a lot of first-class tickets, front row tickets, buy UFC merch, very little of that goes to the fighter. So that makes me very sad.
So what's the solution then?
So the solution has to come for the fighters to fight for themselves. There has to be a collective bargaining. We need the top draws on the sport. Jorge Masvidal, Usman, Ngannou, Conor. We need, I don't know, give me a bunch of other cool draws.
Well, not just for themselves, but they have to.
Yeah, so the top guys, they have to volunteer to help the little guy to make sure that the UFC takes care of all of its fighters. Because if you are a fighter, look, just think about it from this way. If you have fighters who are doing side hustles or they're working full-time and fighting in the UFC, they're obviously not going to be able to they're not performing at their peak 100%. So at least taking care of the fighters better, giving them the space to perform better, making sure that they have medical health care so that when they get injured in training that they can recover properly, we could potentially get a lot better fights out of the UFC if we treated our fighters better. And that's all I really want. As a fan, as a socialist, I want the workers to be treated better. And I want them to be able to fight for themselves, both inside the ring and out. I don't think you have any disagreements with me on this, right?
I agree with it from what I know and for the information that I have right now. Though I have some, I guess, what about the argument that there's other workers in the UFC, not just the fighters? There's like ref, there's judges, there's people who set up the arena.
Of course, wait. I've never said that they should be paid less.
No, I agree, but I'm just saying, like, how do you know the profit? I don't think this is true, but how do you know the profit is actually?
Okay, so I calculated the EBITDA. They saw $152 million increase in their EBITDA. So the UFC generated over $1.11 billion in EBITDA. So this is after they pay everyone. So this is before they have to pay taxes, before they get depreciation expenses. This is just their profit, raw profit. Okay. After they've paid off all their wages, after they've paid for all the athletes' travel, paid all the athletes, that's how much money they have. The great thing about paying your fighters more is that reduces your tax burden. People always complain about corporate taxes. If corporate taxes are high, the corporation is forced, as like there's a premium, there's a benefit to investing back into the company, whether that be your workers by giving them bonuses, whether that's investments in capital to improve your ability to produce, maybe a new APAC center or Fight Island. All of that stuff just gives us more. So the UFC has money to go around. Endeavor doesn't. So probably that's one of the reasons why Dana White, even if Dana White wanted to give fighters more money, there's probably strings preventing him from doing that from Endeavor.
Mm.
But there is money to even pay the workers there who are setting up the ring, who are doing the production, who are doing the interviews, who are doing the promotions. The UFC has an amazing editing team. The embedded videos are absolutely amazing. They're incredibly dramatic. They hype up the fight. That is pure artistry. I want those guys to be paid well too because they are contributing to the product, which is the fight. A fight is a story. Everyone who tells that story is incredibly important.
Okay. Well, that's pretty convincing. Guess I agree with you.
I want to know already. Daniel, show me yours.
All right.
What are your takes on fighters and the current zeitgeist of the UFC?
So I'm going to be talking about fight strategy. So in MMA, there are three main aspects to fighting. You have striking, you have takedowns, and you have ground fighting. Striking arts include boxing, Muay Thai, Taekwondo, karate, etc. Takedown arts include wrestling, judo, sambo, etc. And arts that specialize in the ground include BJJ, catch wrestling, judo, etc., as well as ground and pound. I argue that in order to be good at MMA, you need to be good at two of the three aspects. Here's why. Consider a world champion kickboxer in his first MMA fight. He has amazing hands and feet, but in the first 5 seconds of the match, his opponent, who is a BJJ black belt, double legs him and puts him on his back. He is absolutely clueless about what to do there, and as he can't really punch or kick his opponent. So in panic, he gives up his back, to which the BJJ black belt happily takes and chokes him out. This is exactly how the first UFC fight played out. At the time, no one knew the ground game nearly as well as the Gracie family. And so once Royce Gracie managed to secure a takedown, it was a guaranteed victory. Nowadays, this barely happens because everyone understands that as a striker, you won't survive a round without either a strong ground game or a strong takedown defense game. Conor McGregor, Israel Adesanya, Francis Ngannou, they're all amazing strikers with amazing takedown defense. They control where the fight goes so that they can fully use their striking. Now let's go through all the combinations and see why each of them work. There's striker plus takedown defense, striker plus ground game, takedowns plus ground game. Well, to make this simpler, I'll just call takedowns and takedown defense wrestling and ground game as BJJ. So the reason striker and wrestling works is that you can keep the fight standing where you are superior. Striking plus BJJ works because you'll be able to survive on the feet or the ground regardless where the fight goes. Wrestling and BJJ works because you can force the fight to the ground where you are superior. But something very interesting happens when you pit them against each other. Let's consider striking and wrestling versus BJJ and wrestling. What usually happens here is the fight ends up as a wrestling match, where the ground fighter constantly shoots for the takedown, while the striker desperately scrambles to keep themselves on the field. Now the striker and wrestling versus striker and BJJ, here the fight will likely be contested on the feet, since they are both comfortable on the feet, but the one who is good at BJJ doesn't have the means to take down his opponent. And finally, striker plus BJJ versus ground fighter versus wrestling. This will likely be contested on the ground, since the BJJ wrestler will be able to take the striker down where they will be evenly matched. As you might have noticed, we have shown that the fight will likely be contested in the aspect of fighting that both fighters have in common. With this, you can reliably predict where the fight will happen. But it's less clear how fights between fighters with similar combinations will play out, since they're evenly matched standing or on the ground, and so they won't really have a preference. But I'd bet on the fight being mainly standing, just because the fight starts standing. So, Anirudh, do you agree with this theory or not?
Uh, I'm not gonna lie. I feel like a lot of this is bullshit. Uh,
How?
here's the way that I see it. Right, there's some fighters that you just can't put them into categories like this. Is Kamaru Usman a
Oh yeah,
wrestler?
of course. I mean,
Is Kamaru Usman a wrestler, a striker, jiu-jitsu master? What is he?
heuristics.
Yeah, these are heuristics, but what use are these heuristics?
I mean, so you can get. I mean, let's just go for like Damian Maya versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. You have Damian Maya who has good BJJ and decent, I guess, okay wrestling, and then Stephen Wonderboy Thompson who's an amazing striker and has pretty good uh, takedown defense. It's a pretty smart bet to make that the whole fight will be Damian Maya trying to take him down and Wonderboy stopping the takedowns, right? And same thing with like probably um Usman and Wonderboy Thompson.
Okay, so this is where I'm going to push back because here's the thing about MMA. Your wrestling makes your striking more dangerous.
Okay.
Let's go back to Michael Chandler versus Dan Hooker. That was earlier this year. First main card of the year. First co-main event of the year. Dan Hooker is on paper the way better striker, right? I think we both agreed that going into the fight, he had the reach advantage, he had the height advantage. Michael Chandler was a better wrestler, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason why Michael Chandler knocked the fuck out of Dan Hooker is because Michael Chandler kept going for the single leg, or going for the double leg, going for the takedown, and used that to mix it up, mix martial arts, and knock Dan Hooker out. It seems that using one as trickery for the other is a very useful tool. There are so many fighters who are great at one thing and then they completely change up their style. Brian Ortega was like what you would classify back then, great striker, and great jiu-jitsu guy, terrible wrestling. He came out and he out wrestled the Korean Zombie, who was a very good grappler in his own right, completely, and that was because he completely changed his style. Did his other aspects deteriorate? Probably not by much. It seems as though this is a little too pigeonholey. There are too many restrictions on this, and it's like a gross oversimplification of game. You couldn't even say something like this about jiu-jitsu. It's just one sport, but there's so many factors that go into people's their leverages, their history, their lineage. There's the history of teaching, all the techniques that they've learned, injuries that they had. There's so much more that goes to fighters. Like Yoel Romero is an amazing wrestler. He didn't attempt even attempted one takedown against Israel Adesanya. He didn't care about
Here's
wrestling.
the thing. He doesn't know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like at all. I actually watched a fight between him and
Wait, but he
his
doesn't need
wrestler.
that. If he just takes
No,
Israel as
that's the point.
no, he doesn't.
Hmm?
Wait, just because the takedown happens,
Okay, he
doesn't
has
mean
ground
it's a
and pound,
submission.
yes.
Wait, ground and pound is quite literally how wrestlers first started doing well in the UFC. All the wrestlers in the early 2000s, all they did is just take people down, hold them down, and beat the shit out of them. They didn't need any jujitsu.
But if
They,
they,
they
had
were
Jiu-Jitsu,
they were ground and
they had-
pounding jujitsu black belts like it was nothing.
Mhm.
You don't need jujitsu when you get to the ground. You might need some jujitsu to learn how to defend against submissions, but if you can punch people in the face, just punch people in the face.
I get your point that okay, there's nuances obviously, and also like people are have varying degrees of striking and wrestling and BJJ. It's not like there's actually like a striker and a wrestler and no BJJ. Like everyone probably at least has a blue belt level in BJJ, right? Even if you're Israel Adesanya or Conor McGregor, like all of them
or
are.
Derek Lewis.
Yeah, or Derek
Wait,
Lewis.
Derek Lewis blows everything out of the water. His solution to everything is just land one punch. If you try to take him down, he just stands up. If you try to submit him, he just stands up.
Mm-hmm.
If you take his back, he's just gonna shake you off like a wet dog.
Okay.
This doesn't. I feel like this is great in theory, but this is great from the perspective of a person who's never fought.
I think it actually maps onto reality pretty well. So, for example, Israel Adesanya, you would consider him a striker with takedown defense, pretty much. Like he never goes for submissions, or Like
Wait.
rarely.
He doesn't go
So-
for submissions because he doesn't need to.
Yeah, I know. That's not the point though. The point is he doesn't need to because he's a striker and he wants to knock people out. But if he goes against a wrestler or a ground fighter, you can easily expect the whole fight to be the ground fighter trying to take him down. So there's plenty of examples of this. What else? Let me think.
I feel like Israel Adesanya is one archetype, but his style is very rare. This whole specialist mantra, there's Israel Adesanya, there's Conor McGregor, there's Khabib. There's only one specialist. I think that is it doesn't map onto most fighters. There are 500 fighters fighting for the UFC. I think this model might be successful for maybe 10. You can understand maybe 10 of them with this. This doesn't explain Kamaru Usman. It really doesn't.
Well, I think it used to explain him, and then now he got better at striking, and now he's pretty evenly matched with everyone.
Wait, so if he's all three,
Mm-hmm.
then this model doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I said it's less clear as to how fights between fighters with similar combinations will play out.
Well, it's not even a matter of similar combinations. Most fighters try to go for all three.
That's what similar combinations are, basically. I mean, if you're
Wait,
all
so
three
similar
just-
combination means getting good at the sport. In this context, if you get better at the sport, if your wrestling is shit, everything else is good. By improving your wrestling, you got better at the sport. Just getting better at the sport. I feel like this is
Okay.
a little
I mean,
contrived. I think a better understanding, a better analysis of UFC fighters might just be looking at statistics. Because like ostensibly I'm a data scientist. I like looking at things like their success rate in takedown defense. I will only say a person has good takedown defense if they successfully defended a lot of takedowns. Do you know who has the best takedown defense in all of the UFC? Yes.
John Jones?
No. Kamaru Usman. Only taken down once in the entire UFC.
Okay.
But we don't really talk about that. We say he's a great wrestler because he holds people down against the cage, but he has amazing takedown defense. Damian Maia was the only person who got one takedown against him. And Damian Maia is an amazing jiu-jitsu black belt, and he couldn't do shit with that takedown.
Okay.
Charles Oliveira
Mhm.
got Michael Chandler's back, and he couldn't submit him. I feel like when applied to reality, a lot of this breaks down because you look, Daniel, are
No,
you good at
here's the
predicting
thing,
fights?
Here's the thing. I think if you expand on the model, let's say you still keep the striker, wrestler, and BJJ triple variables, 3
Mhm.
variables, right? And then instead of just having a dummy variable, which is like yes or no for any of them, you instead have varying levels for each of them. And I think if you ran a model where you had outcome of the fight, like where it is, like in on the ground, standing, or takedowns, and you mapped it onto the fighters' levels of striking, wrestling, and BJJ,
Mhm.
you'll probably find a pattern where in the fights where they have the most different levels of striking, wrestling, and BJJ, there will be a higher chance of predicting where the fight will end up, and in the and the place where the fight will end up will be predicted by the discipline in which they are most common in.
Yeah, but this model has to go beyond styles. It has to go to conditioning. It has to go to general strength.
Yeah, of course.
It has to.
Yeah.
So
but
I feel
that's
like
just like
so that's the thing, right? We can never use this model to predict fights. Have you predicted fights reliably?
no one does.
No one does. Well, I mean, there's some who are pretty good.
Well, I mean,
But
I think you can predict where the fight happens pretty accurately. I think you can't really predict who wins that well, but
I mean, by this model, if you can predict where the fight happens, you can also predict who's going to win. Because if the fight stays standing up, the better striker wins. If the fight stays on the ground, the
no,
better
that means
grappler
you
wins.
didn't understand my point, which is that the fight happens where there is the most common skill level, usually, or not usually, but like
The fight happens
all else equal. You have to understand the point that all else equals, ceteris paribus. That's how it works.
Okay, then
Like, if ceteris paribus is implemented, then I think you can actually have a model that works like this. And I think when we're actually thinking about it, we do think in these terms, right?
I mean, look, it's hard to say because how do you quantify a lot of these things? Like quantifying wrestling, Justin Gaethje had next to no wrestling against Khabib.
Well, that's Khabib. Khabib's just like wrestling is like
Yeah, but
way...
Justin Gaethje was literally an all-American wrestler.
Mhm.
He was literally one of the best in the entire country. But his wrestling
Oh,
skill didn't translate as
guess
well
what?
to jiu-jitsu.
That actually applies here because Justin Gaethje is like a striker pretty much, right? He's a striker plus wrestler, right? Khabib's a wrestler and a submission specialist, basically, right?
Okay.
So when you put them two together, this model would say that the fight would be this Justin Gaethje trying to prevent the takedown and Khabib trying to take him down, because those are the common points.
I feel like on like a single fight, you can apply this. Actually, I will take back the statement. I was a little inflammatory. You have convinced me a little. On a single fight, maybe even a single round or in a single exchange, this could apply. I don't see this applying in a broader trend, even if you expand this model. Because Conor McGregor is an amazing striker. Yet, Khabib was the first person to knock him down. First knockdown that Conor ever had. Poirier later knocked him out. But first knockdown ever, Khabib against Conor. Did this by pretending to go for a single leg and then haymaker through the top. I think that this model doesn't predict. I think this is like in game theory, right? You could probably put it in better words than me. The moment you understand the other person's preferred strategy, you can change yours. So the fact is, if you're always guessing another person's strategy or your competition strategy, none of this is applicable because you're not going to commit to anything.
That's not true, because you can still reach equilibrium in which your two strategies are different from each other or the same from each other. I mean, just because you know the other person's strategy, who you know that they know your strategy, and infinite regress, doesn't mean that no strategy works. There is an equilibrium sometimes. So like,
how often is it in MMA? How often?
I mean, okay, for example, if someone's trying to take you down because they're BJJ black belt and you're a white belt, but you're like a champion Muay Thai fighter, you're gonna want to prevent the takedown, right? And so, just because you know that he's gonna take you down doesn't mean you're gonna change your strategy. And just because he knows,
that entirely yes, I'm definitely gonna change my strategy.
Change your strategy as in, given that your strategy is to prevent the takedown.
Wait,
right?
I literally had a camp. I would not only change my learning how to stop the takedown. I changed my stance to go wider, more of a boxing stance, so it's easier for me to sprawl. I would then practice takedown defenses. I would then, on top of that, practice knees, intercepting knees with flying knees, Jorge Masvidal style. I would completely change. This is why we have fight camps. We would completely change our game to apply for the situation we're going against.
Yeah.
I feel like this only works as like a post hoc base level introductory analysis. I don't think this provides a lot of value to anyone who's not a newbie.
Maybe correct, and this hopefully was helpful for you newbies.
Okay,
understanding this.
It is mean for me to be a little extra critical of this, but I think that for the most part, we can't predict the future. I think that's what I love about fighting, is that you kind of have to keep the nerd shit away because the nerds are never right.
I have to counter on something you said about the game theory, because it's actually very incorrect for you to say this, which is that you sort of made the argument that if you can predict the other person, then they can, because the other person knows that you're predicting what they're going to do, there's sort of like this infinite regress, right? Where you're predicting what they're going to do, and they're predicting what you're going to do, and you're going to predict what
I don't
they're
think it's
gonna
infinite regress, but I think that constantly trying to figure out or outplay the opponent is going to create a lot of unknown variables, a lot of randomness into the mix. You're not going to do the same things that
Yes,
you do always.
I agree, but
I was a little hyperbolic on that statement. Yes, I agree.
you can definitely. I think in a lot of fights, you can pretty much predict what their game plan is going to be. Like, what do you think the game plan of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus Burns is going to be?
Oh, it's going to be Stephen Wonderboy Thompson is going to try to kick him in the head.
Yes, but mainly he's going to try to prevent the takedown because he's a superior striker. And Gilbert Burns is obviously a superior grappler.
Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, I honestly don't know. When I looked at the Brian Ortega versus Korean Zombie fight, I for sure thought, okay, Ortega's not gonna have the best hands. He might try to pull guard or do a weird takedown and try to get KZ to the ground. KZ's just gonna get out of the guard because he's a good grappler and then beat the shit out of him. What ended up happening is Ortega breezed through him on the stand up, and then on top of that, he was putting pressure, takedowns, tiring KZ, putting him like exhausting him, and I just didn't expect that. And I feel like for most fights, people can radically change their game plan, and sometimes they do. Even the most Habib is the most predictable fighter, right? Let's say he's the most predictable fighter. He will he will push you behind the two black bars next to the fence, and then he will go for a single leg, head on the outside. I don't know how he does that. Head on the outside. He's then going to try to push you against the cage, take you down by changing levels, and then he's going to wrap your feet in a leg triangle, and then he's going to get you to the ground. He's either going to get you to expose your back or beat the shit out of you. That's what he's always done.
Mm-hmm.
He got every submission that he had was from that type of position.
Okay.
But he's so good at giving people that because he uses his striking to be very unpredictable. His head movement is super unpredictable. His striking is very unpredictable. He gives people no option to be in the middle, so he pushes them to the edge, and the edge, there's only one way to go.
Okay. So what's your point?
So I think that even in the most predictable scenarios, there's too much uncertainty. That when you're trying to apply this game theory and trying to predict your opponent's strategy, I mean, you could hit equilibrium. I just think that's very rare.
I think equilibrium is what happens in most fights.
Do you have a lot of data on this? Because look, here's the thing, right? I'm talking out of my ass. If you have data on this, hard data, you did like an analysis in an SQL program, put in all of this and showed, you gave different attributes to these guys, you gave a good scale, a good methodology, and you said, okay, this model has such a high % validity, fuck you, I'll take that. I just feel like because I feel like all we were doing is arguing examples. I don't know how accurate this is, and we don't know how to measure it. So, you know what, Daniel? I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Maybe this is true. I just don't think you have the data to support it.
Well, I don't think it's like true to a very significant degree either. I mean, obviously fighting is a crazy sport and anything can happen and things are unpredictable. But I think this is just the underlying logic behind how people form their game plans. And that's sort of what I was trying to explain. I wasn't necessarily, I think maybe I wrote too hyperbolically here as well, like reliably. No,
Yeah,
not reliably.
I would take issue with that.
Yeah, like you can kind of predict, you can mediumly predict. I think if I were to rewrite that, but I think when we're analyzing fights and we're trying to figure out like who's gonna win, like what's gonna happen, this is sort of the logic that we use, which is that the striker will try to defend and the grappler will try to take down, and that's like generally and like the different kinds of combinations.
I think it just boils down to you're going to try to put it in the position where you feel like you have the best advantage over your opponent.
Yeah, of course.
If it just boils down to that, I would agree with you. But I think what puts you in the best position is not whether you're a striker or a wrestler or a BJJ guy. I think that calculation is irrelevant to the discussion of put yourself in your best position.
Really? So you think?
Well, I'm okay. Irrelevant is too much. Too much. It's too much. I think it is not
Secondary?
very important. Barely tertiary. Barely quaternary. I don't think it's very. I need to look at data for this before I make any other hard conclusions. But I don't think this is me opinions, feelings. These are my feelings. They're not as powerful as your facts or facts that if you had, I would believe. but I don't think this is very reliable. I think this is a very reductionist way of looking at fighters and their game. I think it's
Ye-
too reductionist
Okay.
to be valuable. That is me. The statement that fighters will look for the place where they have the best advantage, the position with the best advantage, that is like almost tautologically true.
Yeah, it is.
I would agree with you on that.
But
I just
that's
don't think this is how we
almost
come to. I don't think this is how we decide what the best position is. I'll be willing to listen to data. I'll change my mind if there's a lot of strong data on this. I just don't think that there is.
okay. That's fair. Well, we can move on, I guess.
Yes. So, from something that doesn't have a lot of data to something that does have a lot of data, let's talk about COVID 19. Now, because we're talking about COVID 19, there's a good chance that this video will never be monetized. So, please like, comment, subscribe. And in the future, when we have financial ventures, whether it's my book, a possible Patreon, or any type of money, please give that money to us. We will use it to buy better camera and better equipment and better microphones and make this a higher quality production. We'll even hire editors so you don't have to deal with Daniel and I's terrible editing skills. We have all been robbed. COVID 19 has costed the global economy over $16 trillion and nearly 4 million lives. When faced with tragedy, we must endeavor to learn from our mistakes, lest we repeat the cycles of history. COVID 19 has exposed many glaring flaws in our institutions, from healthcare to housing, but the largest shortcoming has been revealed in the inadequacy of our scientific and public health institutions. To understand more, we need to take a trip back to 2014. There was an outbreak of anthrax at a CDC lab where they were conducting gain of function research. The research was built on the premise that given the extraordinary rate of mutations in viruses, scientists should try to add their own mutations in a controlled setting to develop cures ahead of the next epidemic. Gain of function research literally adds new functionality to viruses, whether they be increased transmissibility, drug resistance, or symptoms. The goal was to have cures for diseases before they morphed into pandemics. Unfortunately, the CDC was not careful enough and carelessly created an outbreak of anthrax. Luckily, there were no fatalities, but the Obama administration directed the National Institute of Health to ban gain of function research. Fast forward to 2017, when the Trump administration repealed the Obama era ban, we have a much different story. Peter Daszak, president of EcoHealth, a nonprofit research organization, took $7.5 million in funding from the NIH for gain of function research. $3.7 million went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for research on respiratory viruses. In 2019, there were reports in Wuhan, China, of a new respiratory coronavirus transmitting between people, and you're familiar with the rest. There is enough information for us to ask if COVID 19 is the product of gain of function research and not zoonotic in nature. The Wuhan Institute of Virology denied any claims that they were working with live bats, but footage leaked to Sky News via Australia showed the lab had live bats fluttering within steel cages. Did SARS-CoV-2, the virus that caused COVID-19, come from a lab or a wet market in Wuhan? It's hard to say. The Biden administration has authorized a task force to investigate the lab leak hypothesis, but it's been a year and a half since the pandemic started. We might never know the full details. While a majority of scientists concur that COVID-19 is zoonotic, many, including Stanford professor and microbiologist David Relman, state that the last bit of evolution in the virus's genome could be the product of laboratory research. I must stress that we cannot jump to conclusions. COVID could have been leaked from a lab because scientists mishandled specimens taken from the wild. Instead of the origin of human contact being at a wet market, it could have been a lab coat. We don't know. Hopefully, research will elucidate our doubts and worries, but let's not be overly optimistic. The question I have for Daniel is, should we continue gain of function research, or should we scrap it?
Depends on the risk and reward, I guess.
Well, I'll tell you this. We have next to no rewards, no solutions, no breakthroughs from gain of function research. And the cost of gain of function research is $16 trillion and nearly 4 million lives.
I mean, I think then the solution seems pretty clear then.
Go back to the Obama era ban?
Yeah, I mean, unless you could argue that we still haven't tapped into the true potential of gain of function research. And that the only reason we really didn't come up with anything from that is just because we haven't tried hard enough. Unless you make that argument, then
it's
sounds
possible.
like it's not worth it, I guess. But were there any other outbreaks other than this?
Yes.
Yeah, you said
there was a case of anthrax. There were cases of
Any other?
flus, bird flu in 2000, the 2009 H1N1, bird flu, and there was also a case of salmonella, I believe.
Okay.
Again, those were relatively small, but leaks are common because humans make mistakes. We there's not a lot of oversight in gain of function research, and unfortunately, because this is such a hot button issue, there are a lot of people who are calling for banning gain of function research. I want to know what your take on it is. Is this the first time you're hearing of it?
Well, I know the gist of it
Okay.
beforehand, but um, I mean, is there any way to? You said there's not much oversight in gain of function research. Is that
Yes.
seriously true? I mean, given that there's already been like flu outbreaks and anthrax outbreaks because of human error, then I feel like there should be more.
So again, you have to understand
Oversight,
this was
right?
happening in Wuhan, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Their standards for containment probably are a lot different than in the United States. The United States just banned gain of function research. There are other parts of the world where this research is happening all the time.
Mm-hmm.
In all, I believe it was in almost every major city. There's at least one lab that's practicing gain of function research in some capacity. So it seems as though this research is just going to happen, and it's not a question of if something escapes the lab or if there is a containment break. It's going to be a matter of when and how big. Because anthrax, at least, it can't become a pandemic. It doesn't spread quickly enough. It's deadly.
Mm-hmm.
You can sometimes save people who catch them early, but it's not going to spread. Something like smallpox, though, because both the United States and Russia have smallpox stored. They have samples of smallpox, and if they do gain of function research on that, they might risk having another outbreak of smallpox.
Yeah, this sort of reminds me of like nuclear weapons and nuclear research because
Yes.
it's almost the exact same situation where there's potential for such benefit, but
The costs are
Yeah.
so great.
so I don't know. Is there any way maybe like we could? I mean, everyone has PTSD from coronavirus right now, so maybe people will become more careful, or countries will implement more oversight and security measures for
I would hope so.
the gain of function research.
But now it's the question of should gain of function research even be valid? Yeah, should it be?
What do you mean
even,
valid?
So, okay, is it even a valid form of research we should engage in? Is it a good idea to engage in that type
Okay,
of research?
you said there's literally no advances. I kind of find that hard to believe because
Well,
like why
there-
would they have labs in like you said there's research in like every lab. So there must
again,
be
there's a little bit of hyperbole, but there, at
Mhm.
least when I was finding the benefits of gain of function research, I literally asked evolutionary biologists if I could interview them on this for this podcast.
really.
Yeah, I tried to. The funniest reply is try looking into some more worthwhile avenues of research. That's the response that I got. So again, it's very hard for me to say this. My personal opinion is, and this is going to upset everyone, my opinion on both nuclear power and gain of function research is the same. We need it. So, Daniel, you're aware that in Siberia the permafrost is melting, right?
Yeah. Oh, okay. I've
So
heard about
one of
that.
the issues there is that a lot of diseases are coming back because there were bodies that were filled with diseases like smallpox and other eradicated diseases that are now being exposed, and we could have a potential outbreak of that disease. Let me tell you this. If the cost for averting a smallpox pandemic is COVID-19, I will pay that cost 10 times over. Because smallpox, at least the variola, the most common, has a common strain, has a 30% case fatality rating. The more hemorrhagic version has nearly 70%. If smallpox were to break, smallpox is also an airborne virus. Masks won't stop it. It'll linger in the air for days.
Okay, so
If
it's
that
not
happens,
so COVID isn't airborne, it's like droplets.
droplets,
right?
yes. Smallpox is airborne.
Hmm. Shit.
If smallpox does make a resurgence and we did not engage in gain of function, we could see quite literally the reduction of a quarter to half of all of human life on this planet. Given how integrated our supply chains are, given how easy it is to travel around the world, if smallpox spreads, it could be not the end of humanity, but a major setback in human evolution. It could be the second coming of the Black Plague, the Black Death to Electric Boogaloo. So if the cost of preventing that catastrophe is COVID-19, I will pay that cost. I think gain of function research is valid. I think I agree with you that we need to do everything in our power to regulate it properly so that we can contain this. We've had leaks at nuclear power plants, but to this day, nuclear power plants, one of the reasons why nuclear energy is so expensive is building the plants is very expensive. And building the plants are very expensive because we require so many security fail-safes. We need to do the same thing here. I want gain of function research to be done by some of the most reputed scientists in the most secure facilities on the planet. I don't care if those scientists have to live in bunkers 2 miles underneath the ground. I want to make sure that that is done. I want to invest in this research, and I think it is worthwhile. Unfortunately, my opinion is not politically feasible at all. I don't think it's going to happen because the Biden administration already cut funding to gain of function research, and it seems like governments around the world are also doing the same thing.
Like you said, it's sort of, I mean, they obviously have concern for another pandemic, but it's also a little bit virtue signaling, right? Like, even if, for example, they know about the potential of preventing another future disease by, coming up with a virus before it actually, vaccine, okay, by coming up with a vaccine before it actually happens, the popularity of this it's going to be so hard to pass through the government, right? No one's going to like it. So, anyway, you were saying the premise of you supporting this is that gain of function research has strong potential to be able to come up with this vaccine. Yet
I don't think it has a strong potential because we haven't seen any results. Even if it's 1%, I'll take it. Because I view the second coming of smallpox as an existential crisis. A 1% chance to fight against it is huge, in my opinion.
Well, I guess how risky is the permafrost thing going to actually destroy the humans?
So again, this is this has to be taken into the calculation.
Yeah, exactly.
From what I have read about the permafrost thing, scientists are very worried about it. They seem to be more worried about it than gain of function research. That's a threshold, at least for me. If the probability of smallpox coming back is greater than the probability of gain of function research causing another global pandemic, then let's go for it. Let's do. Because one is so much greater, that's not even easy to quantify. The costs for human civilization, for human society, for all of humanity, if half of us die,
you have to multiply the chance of the smallpox creating a pandemic with our chance of actually creating a vaccine together. So, and then compare that to the chance of another pandemic caused by the gain of function.
I don't know how we could make a model to evaluate all of that.
I know, but you said if there's a 1% chance.
Hyperbole again. But look.
I know, but like
I don't know how you could even create a mathematical model to carefully weigh the risks and costs and the benefits. I don't know. Generally speaking, I operate by this rule. If a lot of scientists believe there's a positive NPV in doing it, then I suggest we go for it. What I did not like is people like Fauci, people like Peter Daszak. Fauci was one of the people who were lobbying the Trump administration to remove the restrictions on gain of function research. There are people like that who are not very transparent. I view them as bad actors. I require that I can trust scientists. I can do that. I just need them to be more transparent. Dr. Fauci has completely lost my trust in him forever. I just cannot trust a single thing that man says. He went onto a news program and he says, I represent science. If you criticize me, you criticize science. That is one of the most egotistical, moronic things I've ever heard. There are certain people who are just bad actors that you cannot trust. Dr. Fauci is one of them. But the actual scientific institutions, they need to do a better job at being transparent. I did not like the fact that the World Health Organization helped China cover and suppress some of the early outbreak information from coronavirus. I don't like the fact that there's no transparency from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, who told us, they straight-faced lie, that there were not bats being experimented on and then we have leaked footage, leaked to Sky News in Australia, that there were live bats in that facility. This lack of accountability is a huge problem. Any step forward, I need 100% accountability to make sure that this kind of situation doesn't happen again. Because when these things are done in the dark, we have consequences. We need adequate warning. There was so much misinformation going around, especially in the during the outbreak of COVID, about whether masks work or the origins or this theory. Some people believe that it was a racist to suggest that this leaked out of a lab in China, whereas it was not racist to say that this was because Chinese people were eating bats. It's there's too much. The news establishment, the medical establishment, they were playing games instead of just being honest and transparent about what was happening. Their fear of a public backlash has completely eroded their trust in a way far greater than any public backlash. I think that we need good actors in this. There needs to be a systemic review, an audit of all of these actors, who did what they knew. The leaked Fauci emails showed that Dr. Fauci knew about all the gain of function research done in this Wuhan lab. He was in contact with Peter Daszak. Apparently, they were close friends. There's just not enough transparency to continue business as usual. My argument is not we go back to business as usual with gain of function research. There need to be intense reforms. We need to make sure the medical establishment is cleaned. We need to make sure that there is strong regulations and strong transparency guidelines to make sure this never happens again. And someone like Dr. Fauci cannot be in charge of that institution. What's your take on this, Daniel? Do you disagree with me?
Yeah, if we get to a point where the regulations are strong enough to prevent another outbreak like COVID, then yeah, I say why not? If there's a chance of preventing another future pandemic from, like you said, smallpox from the permafrost or something. Yeah. I think it's a reasonable take.
Yeah. I try not to be emotional about this, but I am so deeply upset with just being lied to. I would prefer if we had one concrete, transparent narrative, but it seems that these medical institutions, and look, they're fighting over a couple $1 million worth of funding. Yet in 2019, there was a $180 billion increase to the military spending budget in the United States. We need more transparency, and we can afford to take the costs to improve our public health. Okay. But they're not good actors that we can trust, and that's a big worry for me. Because here's the thing, right? I'm relatively amenable to science. A random redneck in Tennessee? Good luck convincing them that vaccines don't cause autism. That was already a struggle. Good luck convincing them that this vaccine doesn't have a microchip from Bill Gates. It's already hard enough to do that. This is just conspiracy bait. This lack of accountability, lack of transparency is the bait for conspiracy theorists who are going to send ridiculous misinformation over WhatsApp. I don't know if you ever heard of this documentary called Plandemic, where they actually talked about some of these things. They said, Fauci was friends with Peter Daszak, Wuhan Institute of Virology. He knew a lot about this. There was so much information there. But in the middle of it, there was one lady who says, wearing the mask activates your own virus. And it just, my God, how could you say some right things but said 50 fucking wrong ones? This is what happens. If we do not have proper honesty, liars and charlatans will rule the internet. I cannot forgive Dr. Fauci for lying about masks. That, and on top of that, him being transparent about the gain of function research, and now his egotistical remarks of saying, I am science. Fuck Fauci. Hashtag fuck Fauci. This is probably going to be our most controversial episode. I love this.
Yeah.
So Daniel, from
another controversial take.
Let's go.
Why herd immunity is a useless statistic.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. Go for it.
If you've ever read the news about COVID, it seems like journalists are obsessed with the question, when are we going to reach herd immunity? And I think people are collectively asking this question because they believe that once we reach this magic threshold, we will be safe from COVID, or at least significantly safer from it than we were before. But I'm here to shatter that pipe dream because reaching herd immunity is nothing more than an arbitrary statistic used to standardize and normalize infection rate across populations. First, let me explain what herd immunity is. The idea is that as more people become immune to COVID as a result of either vaccination or contracting the disease already, the rate of transmission to non-immunized people will decrease. The reason for this is that the way we transmit contagious diseases is by coming into contact with other people. By the simple fact that more people are now immunized, a smaller proportion of the people we bump into are able to get sick from us. And so the rate of infection decreases as immunity increases. This is a pretty obvious view, right? However, many people think that this phenomenon occurs only at a certain threshold, where once a certain number of people become immune, we reach herd immunity. But before I explain why this is wrong, there's actually a very tempting reason for why you might believe in this false view. So let's think about the model of disease transmission. We have infected people, uninfected people, and immune people, right? Infected people can infect uninfected people. It's going to get kind of complicated, but infected people cannot infect immune people. And infected people eventually either die or recover to become immune. Now, if we plot the total number of infected people across time, so not total as in the cumulative number of infected people, but the amount of people we have right now across time, we will see a normal distribution, so like this kind of shape. And this is because initially we only have a few people who are infected, so infection rate is really slow, but exponentially increases as more people become infected, and they themselves become vectors of infection, so we have an increase. However, this exponential increase doesn't continue infinitely. This is because as the number of infected people increase, the number of immune people also increase, and the number of uninfected people decreases. So essentially, the amount of people who can infect others is always increasing, but the number of people who can be infected is also always decreasing too. And so there comes a point where the rate of transmission dips below the rate of recovery. And that's when the total number of infected people flatlines and begins to decrease. That's the peak of the normal distribution. So it is true that there is a point where the net infection rate goes below zero, which is at that point, as a result of the mechanisms of herd immunity. But this point isn't meaningful for you and I, because transmission rates are still above zero at that point, and it's changing at the same rate as it was before and after we reach the top of the normal curve. And so that's why I don't find it a useful metric for claiming that once we reach herd immunity, we're all safe, because that's not true. So what do you think?
I mean, there's some stuff that I don't understand. I know this because look at measles, right? Whenever there is a community that doesn't get vaccinated for measles, we see outbreaks for measles. And at least in France, I remember this because I was reading an article on Le Monde that any time that the herd immunity rate or the vaccination rate for measles dropped below 92%, there was a huge outbreak among school children. It was like either 92 or 94. I don't have the exact numbers in my head. But it's like when it falls to a certain threshold, there's an immediate outbreak at that time. I think there might be some validity to it for diseases that were like next to eradicated. Like, for example, we have herd immunity from smallpox and polio. We're not going to get smallpox and polio because everyone who has it has already died and we've been vaccinated everyone. I have not received a smallpox vaccine because I lived in a time after smallpox was eradicated. If smallpox comes back, I'm a dead man. So I wouldn't say that herd immunity is, I think herd immunity is very vague. I think the numbers are very hard to calculate. I think it changes for every disease, but I don't think it's a useless statistic.
I think, like I already said, herd immunity is a perfectly valid concept in itself, and that's actually the reason why it's even shaped like this and not just infinite. You know, so for example, the measles and the measles example you gave, it makes sense that like if everyone is vaccinated, or at least like almost everyone is vaccinated, then if someone gets measles, then it's very unlikely for other people to.
Yeah.
And if no one's vaccinated or very little people vaccinated, then measles will spread. That's pretty self-explanatory and it makes sense. But the point is that there's no actual threshold where once you cross it, then the transmission rate suddenly jumps or suddenly decreases. That's not the case. It's like gradual. And so it's not like you have to have 90.5% of people
I mean,
vaccinated.
I think it's very
perfectly fine.
gradual if there is a community that doesn't, if there's a community that does not vaccinate, whether it's the Orthodox Jewish community or the Somali community in Minnesota, and immediately in that entire area there's a huge outbreak of measles. I feel like there's like a very drastic on-off switch right there. I think getting to herd immunity, you have some validity in saying that there's not going to be like a certain number we reach and then everything is perfect. It's like things are going to be more perfect the closer we get to 100% vaccination.
Yeah, I know. Like, but that's not like reaching herd immunity. That's just herd immunity affecting us more and more proportional to how much we vaccinate.
Yeah,
It's not.
so I think herd immunity is the point where we can trust people to not spread the virus to us. And we can trust people not to spread smallpox to us because no one has smallpox. I don't know. I feel like your contention might not be with herd immunity, but the way that the discourse behind herd immunity, how we talk about it. I think you're more.
Yeah, that's
I think
actually like
you're more upset with how the media, journalists, reporters talk about herd immunity as some sort of magic number that solves all of our problems. Republican politicians too, rather than just the scientific concept itself.
Yeah, exactly. The scientific concept is just basically math.
Yeah.
It's-
So, I mean, if you remember what I said about misinformation, people are stupid. I mean, they're not going to talk about this in a responsible way. They're going to say stupid things about this, and I think that's just what triggered you.
And also the math of it is very interesting because you have to understand acceleration velocity. You have to understand rate and the rate of the rate.
Okay.
Because if the rate of transmission if the rate of the transmission doesn't change, so basically
If the rate of the rate doesn't change,
so the rate of the transmission is, say, like, let's say it's a 9% transmission rate for every person. So every person transmits the virus to one other person. That's the rate of transmission. That basically describes how risky it is to get the vaccine. I mean, to get
the disease.
Yeah, to get the disease, right?
Vaccines are safe. Take them, please.
That's the rate of transition. That's the rate of transmission. The rate of transmission is how much it changes over time.
Yeah.
Right? So if that is constant across the number of people who get vaccinated, then it makes no sense to say that at a certain point there's a much better safety.
Possibly, but I don't think the rate of the rate ever stays constant.
I think it does here because it's like acceleration.
So how about this? I'll explain this in a way for the people who don't understand calculus to visualize this. You know logarithmic graphs? You don't need to know what a logarithm is. Just know those logarithmic graphs that you can see on COVID reports. If there's a straight line of logarithmic graph, that means it's a constant growth of, say, 9%. If the graph looks curvy, then that means there's a growth on top of growth. That it's going to be 9% one day, then 11%, then 13%, then 15%. It's growing on top of every growth. That is what Daniel's saying. I think for the most part, we don't see like straight growth. Mostly because we have changing conditions, the population size changes. If half the people are already infected, and they won't get it again, I think they're going to start seeing a negative growth in the rate of transmissions. And I think that's what's going to eventually lead to zero. The second difference,
of course,
the second derivative is going to be negative.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think the moment the second derivative becomes negative, I think that's what we should consider herd immunity.
No, but
it's been a while since I've done calculus.
Yeah, same. So the total infection rate, wait.
Daniel, why are you torturing me with math?
I think my point was there's no such thing as that switching to negative.
I mean, that has definitely happened. The fact is, there was one point where millions of people would get smallpox, and now there's no one with smallpox. That we eradicated smallpox. I mean, polio was, I think, back in 2016, eradicated in Pakistan, the last country that had polio. We eradicated it from the planet. That is nothing if not a negative second difference or a negative second derivative. Us vaccinating people is quite literally a negative second derivative.
Uh, Okay, I think I know how to think about the math now. Let's talk about math. Come on, it's so
Oh,
interesting.
no.
So you have this curve. This is
It's gonna be my
the
mom's favorite episode.
number of yes. This is the number of people in percent who have the disease, right? Who have COVID. It's like this, right, across time.
We can add a graph in post. You don't need to do that.
Okay, just like doing this. So at this point, at the peak of it, right?
Okay.
This is when the rate of infection goes negative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or well, the rate of transmission,
Yes.
because obviously infections are still happening. People are still contracting the virus. But the point is that so many people already have it that they're recovering at a faster rate than the people who are newly getting it.
Oh, so are we count, because I was doing this all like people who test positive for the first time. I'm not thinking about people who still have the disease. I'm thinking about like new positive test results.
Yeah. What about it?
So that's irrelevant if people get better or not, or if they die or not.
Well, if you're just considering the summation of all new people who get it, it's gonna be increasing for like right until it gets to until the disease is eradicated. Because no matter how many people heal or recover, as long as one new person gets the disease, then you add on to
Wait.
that,
So I'll push back again on that because good containment policies in places like New Zealand saw that the first few people who got COVID just recovered from it and didn't. It wasn't. There were no cases there. I feel like New Zealand only had like a couple thousand COVID cases throughout the entire pandemic.
right? Okay.
So I feel like we can even make artificial herd immunity that way by preventing it from spreading at all by closing down your borders. I feel like herd immunity is real. I mean, scientists write a lot of papers on it. I feel like it is real. I mean but that's a logical fallacy. That's deferring to authority. I'm not a biologist. I'm not an epidemiologist.
Well, you're a data scientist. This is very data sciencey, right?
Yeah, I guess, but there's not a lot of data here.
Well, it's like statistics.
There are not any numbers here. I don't think you. Wait, Daniel.
Theoretical.
Daniel, in your entire monologue, you have not given me a single number. The only number I have is a page number.
Well, this is theoretical. This is like math. I mean, statistics isn't just like finding data and analyzing.
So this is something.
Statistics is like also the math behind it, which doesn't require data.
The math of statistics is so much less important than the actual methodology for how those numbers are gotten. The validity of the numbers gotten. Look, I actually explained this to a guy at Costco once because he was very skeptical about why people should trust data. So I explained this to him. He basically said that, we have data for anything. If you look at any of the data, you can crunch them in any way, you can come to any conclusion. And I said, we make the mistake of getting the wrong types of data and creating bad models to get them. I'll give you a good example, right? Back in 2016, every poll predicted that Hillary Clinton was going to win by a landslide against Donald Trump. But she lost. The reason why she lost was because the polls were all looking at registered voters instead of likely voters. Likely voters favored Trump. So based on the methodology of how people would answer to certain questions, we got different results. So even in polling data, if we don't have a good methodology, we can results that are not accurate. Likewise, I don't know enough about what a good methodology looks like for epidemiology, so I can't qualify on the data science of this. But the math itself, Daniel, what you're saying is not wrong. I just don't think it takes into account everything, because you're looking at a population. So you're saying that at half the population infected.
Not half, but
around half, right?
No. Okay. Normal distribution is not what I actually mean by that. It's like a normally shaped curve where
so a bell curve.
Yeah, a bell curve across time.
Okay, so
that's the total number of currently infected people.
Okay, so I looked at the bell curve as in terms of population, the percentage of population.
I should have explained that better.
Okay, then that makes so much more sense. Then yeah, obviously, if we're looking at over time, This model, the herd immunity model, doesn't make any sense because the herd immunity doesn't take into context time. Time is irrelevant to herd immunity. What's
Oh,
relevant is the percentage of the population infected.
across time, yeah.
No, not across time. Just the percentage of the population affected at all. At least regarding COVID-19.
Okay.
So if there is no one with COVID-19, there's no COVID-19 being spread. If everyone has COVID-19 recovered, we're at herd immunity where it can't spread between people.
Mm-hmm.
But that has to do with the number of people who are vaccinated or have recovered from the disease. That has nothing to do with like the timeline for when that happens. Because if you have something spread out as a timeline, you could have a situation where 1 million people were infected every day. We don't even have a rate. It's just 1 million people were infected every day. And then you could never reach herd immunity because you would need to have wait 300 days for everyone to get there. You would have a completely different model for herd immunity. I flubbed up the explanation there. That one is on me. No, so but if we have like an arbitrary number of people, let's say we get like one person infected every day. There are 300 million people. We're never going to reach herd immunity, right?
What do you mean by herd immunity? That's my main point.
So herd immunity is the point where the disease is not going to spread like crazy. Spread like crazy means it becomes a situation where you can no longer contain it, right? If one person gets measles, you can lock them in a room, throw away the key, check back, give them a little bit of water, check back on them after a couple of weeks, measles gone. If we get to the point where just that one person existing, we can't lock them up in the room. They've already talked to 50 different people and then they're not vaccinated, so it spreads and the entire town has measles, that's different. So if herd immunity is the point where the outbreak of the disease can't be contained.
So what do you mean by contain? Like, so like everyone who has COVID has to stay. If you're able to force everyone who has COVID to stay in their
Okay,
house,
if the disease doesn't
doesn't make any
become a
sense because
rapidly spreading pandemic, where there's exponential growth, when there is not exponential growth, I think that I consider that herd immunity.
okay, so you're saying like, so you actually agree with, so you actually agree that like we're not, you actually agree with the journalist then that once you reach the point where transmission rate, where the total number of infected people currently is not increasing, then that's herd immunity.
No, not if the total number of people infected is not increasing. I think it's at the point where there are next to zero new cases. I look at it in terms of new cases.
Okay, that would be literally like that would be basically when the pandemic is over. That's
Yeah.
basically the very end
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the.
Wait, so herd immunity doesn't bring about the end of the pandemic. The end of the pandemic brings about herd immunity.
Then like, see, then I don't think you're referring to herd immunity in the same way that everyone else is, because if herd immunity means there's like next to no new cases, then that's basically when the pandemic's over and like no one
Maybe okay.
People refer to herd immunity as this. This is what I think. They refer to it as when you reach a point where
I need to search up
currently
like,
infected is
medical definition. I need the medical definition because I do not trust myself. Herd immunity occurs when a large portion of the community becomes immune to the disease, making the spread of the disease from person to person unlikely. Okay, there's not.
Yeah, so basically just the argument that that's like slowing down, but what does it mean to reach herd?
Ask science. Okay, this could be good.
Herd immunity arises from the fact that if a large proportion of the population is vaccinated, then any individual who becomes infected is unlikely to come into contact with another unvaccinated person before they either succumb to or clear the infection. And therefore outbreaks don't happen because the infectious agent never has a chance to spread. And therefore the few unvaccinated individuals in the population are essentially immune.
Okay, so herd immunity means that even people who are not vaccinated are unlikely to get it.
Yeah, but the problem is like this is still like a tautology because it's just saying like when is the pandemic over?
I feel like that's okay. Wait, so then so I did have the correct definition per this person who has I had no credentials whatsoever.
Evolutionary theory and population genomics. That's basically that.
Do they have? I guess there's this random scientist on Reddit who claims to have a degree in evolutionary theory and genomics. Again, I don't know. Words are complicated. What I care about is the state where we don't have more dead people.
The pandemic.
Right. Let's get to the end of the pandemic.
Yeah,
Fuck herd immunity. Let's get to the end of the pandemic.
exactly. There's no magic number, bro. It's literally just continuous, smooth transition to the end of the pandemic.
Let's get
There's
100
no jump.
Let's
at
go
all.
110% vaccination. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly.
I got the Pfizer. I'll get the Moderna too, and I'll get the Johnson and Johnson.
Yeah.
I mean, the vaccines were terrible on me. I gained like 6 pounds from them, but I'll do it if it means fixing all of this and not having
If
to
I
do.
only gained 6 pounds from the vaccine, that would be nice.
Yeah, I gained 6 pounds of fat. Not nice. Oh, well, I'm on my way to losing. But I think that is okay. That is today's show on the Dialect. This has been episode 3. I ask and beg of our audience, please like, comment, and subscribe. We want to get YouTube traction. The more traction we get, the more quickly we can get this channel monetized. The quicker we can get this channel monetized, the sooner I can pursue my dreams of being an amazing speaker.
Shameless.
You're doing this for me. Please, if you love me, do it. If you don't like me, still do it because I am a workaholic, and if I'm in self-employed, I'll work forever and I'll work myself into early grades. So even if you hate me and you want me to die as quickly as possible, do this. So I'll work myself to an early death. I'll still be happy doing it, but still. Daniel, do you have any final words?
Like and subscribe.